Don't, Wren said. Her voice didn't shake. That surprised her more than anything else in the room. She looked at his hand, still loose at his side, inches from where Sable's body pressed into his space. She looked at the fire behind him, dying in the hearth, the way 4 years of her life apparently had, without her noticing the exact moment it went out. How long? Wren asked. Has she been back? Silence answered before he did. And silence, she would learn that night, could be louder than any confession. Roran's jaw worked, but nothing came out. Sable's fingers slid slowly from his collar, unbothered, almost amused, like she already knew how this ended. Wren, let me explain. You had 4 years to explain things to me. Her voice cracked once on the last word, and she hated that he'd found the one crack she didn't know was there. Instead, I find out like this. He said nothing. That was the answer. It had always been the answer. Wren nodded once, like closing a file, and turned. The oak door shut behind her. Final, quiet, and colder than anything he could have said to stop her. 4 years ago, Wren Ashcombe had arrived in Duskmere with a single suitcase and no wolf blood in her veins. Somehow, she had ended up running a kingdom that Roran Vane merely ruled. There was no title for what she did. Duskmere's true beater had died at the border 2 winters before she'd ever set foot in the estate, and no one else had the stomach, or the mind, for the work that followed. So Wren did it, quietly, methodically, without complaint. She reconciled the Eastern grain accords past midnight. She memorized which minor pack alphas hated which, and why, and what it would cost to smooth it over. She drafted the letters Roran signed with his own name, and never once asked who had written them. She told herself it didn't matter that nobody thanked her. That had been the deal she'd made with herself in the first year. Invisible labor, visible kingdom. She'd gotten very good at being necessary. She had never quite figured out how to be chosen. Tonight, she learned that the household had known Sable Thorn was back a full 3 days before Wren did. She found this out in the kitchens, 20 minutes before she walked into that study. One of the younger maids let it slip. Lady Thorne's rooms, the East Wing, she arrived Tuesday, and then went pale, realizing what she'd said, to whom she'd said it. Tuesday, Wren repeated. The maid's silence was answer enough. 3 days. 3 days of Wren sitting across from Roran at supper, discussing the Southern Militia's tithe schedule, watching him rub his temple like a man carrying an ordinary burden, while a woman he'd once loved slept in a wing of his own house, and nobody thought Wren deserved to know. That was the wound beneath the wound. Not that Sable had come back. People came back. Exes resurfaced. Old alliances got renegotiated. That was simply how pack politics worked. What gutted Wren was smaller and colder than that. She had spent 4 years believing her value to Roran was self-evident, that competence had bought her a kind of belonging no title could match. And in one afternoon she'd learned that the entire staff, down to the newest maid scrubbing pots, had silently agreed she wasn't owed the truth. She wasn't pack. She wasn't beta. She wasn't even, apparently, someone you warned. She was staff, who happened to sleep in the good wing. Wren didn't cry in the kitchen. She thanked the maid, told her she wasn't in trouble, and walked the long way to Roran's study, past the war room, past the portrait gallery of alphas going back 6 generations, none of whom had ever needed a human woman to keep their ledgers straight. She walked slowly. She told herself she was giving him a chance to have an explanation ready. She did not expect to open the door and find Sable's hand already curled into his collar. That part of the night, everyone would eventually hear about. The door, the fire, the single word, don't, that left Wren's mouth before she'd decided to say anything at all. What no one would know, because she never told it, was what happened in the 10 seconds before she opened that door. Standing in the corridor, hand on the handle, already knowing, somehow, in the marrow-deep way a body knows a storm is close, that whatever was on the other side of that door was going to cost her something she couldn't get back. She opened it anyway. She had never once in 4 years let herself flinch away from a hard truth. She wasn't about to start now. not even to protect herself. That was the thing about Ren that Roran had never understood, not really. He thought her strength was patience, the quiet, uncomplaining kind that let a kingdom run smoothly around his temper. He was wrong. Her strength was that she would always choose the truth over her own comfort, every single time, even when the truth was a knife with her name carved into the handle. She hadn't known, until that night, that she had a whole other kind of strength underneath that one. Something older, something that had nothing to do with ledgers or loyalty. Her grandmother's pendant, a small, unremarkable piece of tarnished silver Ren had worn since childhood, and never once taken off, sat cold against her collarbone as she stood in that doorway. It had always been cold. It had never done anything but sit there, a keepsake, a superstition her grandmother used to call Warden's Iron, half joking, the way old women joke about things they actually believe. It would not stay cold for much longer, but Ren didn't know that yet. Standing in the doorway of a study that no longer felt like hers, all she knew was the fire dying behind Roran's shoulders, and the 4 years suddenly rearranging themselves in her mind into something that looked, from this new angle, much more like servitude than love. How long has she been back? She'd already asked him. Now she asked the harder question, the one that actually mattered. Did you ever intend to tell me? And when Roran said nothing to that either, Ren understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that she already had her answer. She'd simply refused to look at it until now. She should have felt something break. Instead, she felt something settle, cold, precise, final, like a ledger closing on a debt that would never be repaid. Did you ever intend to tell me? Ren asked again, because he hadn't answered the first time, and silence deserved to be asked twice before she let herself believe it. Roran's jaw worked. I was going to. I just needed to handle her father's militia first, and I didn't want you carrying that weight on top of everything else you already don't. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle, which made it land harder than shouting would have. Don't tell me you were protecting me. You weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourself from having to watch my face while you told me. Sable, to her credit, had the sense to step back from him now, though her expression stayed maddeningly composed, as if she were watching a mildly interesting negotiation, rather than the end of something. Her father controls the largest militia on the southern border, Roran said. If I lose that alliance, the rebellion sweeps through the outposts by spring. I didn't have a choice. You had a choice about telling me. Ren stepped further into the room, past the point of retreat, past the point where this could still be smoothed into something survivable. You had 4 years of choices, Roran. Every single night I sat across from you translating your temper into policy other alphas could live with. You had a choice to treat me like someone who deserved to know what was happening in her own home. You chose silence every time. Tonight was just the first time I caught you at it. That's not fair. No, Ren agreed. It isn't. None of this has been. She looked, one last time, at the space between his hand and Sable's shoulder. Barely 6 inches, and yet it might as well have been the entire eastern border. She catalogued it, the way she catalogued everything, precisely, without flinching, filing it away where it could never again surprise her. I want you to know, she said, that I am not leaving because of her. I'm leaving because you looked at me tonight and decided, one more time, that I didn't need the truth. That's the pattern, Roran. She's just the proof of it. Ren. I'm not finished. Something in her tone made even Sable go still. For 4 years I have been the reason this kingdom didn't fall apart around your temper. I did it because I loved you, and because I told myself that being necessary was its own kind of belonging. I was wrong. Necessary isn't the same as chosen. You never once chose me. You just never got around to losing me. The fire popped again, and this time nobody in the room pretended not to hear it. Roran crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, reaching for her hand the way he might have reached for a wolf he was trying to calm. Let me fix this. You can't fix 4 years of silence in one conversation. She let him take her hand for exactly 1 second, long enough to feel, One final time, the particular warmth of him she'd built half her life around. And then she withdrew it, deliberately, the way she withdrew authorization on a bad trade deal. Final. Documented. Beyond appeal. I'm leaving tonight. Ren. It's a storm out there. The southern roads are already flooding. Then I'll find another way. She was already turning toward the door, already feeling the strange, terrible calm settle over her that came, she would later understand, right before the worst decisions of a person's life. Or the best ones. She hadn't yet learned to tell the difference. This is treason, Roran said, and his voice cracked on the word, like even he couldn't quite believe he'd said it. If you leave the territory without, then arrest me. She turned back just long enough to look him fully in the face, amber eyes and all, the eyes she'd once thought held the whole of her future in them. Or let me go, and finally learn what this kingdom looks like, without me holding it together. He didn't move to stop her. That, more than anything else that had happened in that study, told her everything she needed to know about what she had actually been to him. The oak door shut behind her with a sound like a verdict. She didn't cry in the corridor. She didn't cry on the stairs, or in the servants' passage, or standing in the freezing rain beside the old rusted vehicle she kept for the rare nights she needed to disappear, without a wolf's nose finding her trail. She simply drove, out through the estate gates, out past the last watchtower, into a storm that seemed, for the first time in 4 years, to actually match how she felt. Somewhere behind her, a light burned in the highest window of Duskmere. She didn't look back to check whose silhouette stood in it. She had already given that kingdom enough of her attention. Tonight, for the first time, she was only thinking about where the road would take her next. The storm hadn't let up by the time Ren reached the edge of Duskmere territory, and she was grateful for it. Rain gave her an excuse for the water on her face that had nothing to do with weather. She didn't drive blindly. That wasn't who she was, even now, even gutted. 20 minutes before she'd walked into that study, some quiet, calculating part of her, the part that had run a kingdom's ledgers for 4 years, had already begun preparing for an ending she hadn't consciously admitted was coming. She pulled over at the old grain depot on the eastern road, cut the engine, and sat in the dark for exactly 4 minutes while she did the only thing she knew how to do with pain. She turned it into work. From the depot's dead drop box, the one only she and 2 trusted couriers knew existed, she retrieved a sealed ledger and a set of authorization seals. Her seals, the ones that let grain move from the eastern granaries to the southern outposts, the ones Roran had never bothered to learn how to use because she had always used them for him. She didn't destroy them. That would have been petty, and petty wasn't her currency. Instead, she rerouted them, quietly transferring the active authorization codes into a holding pattern that would freeze all Eastern shipments the moment the current rotation cleared. Not sabotage, just absence. The exact shape of what she'd been to Duskmere, made suddenly, undeniably visible by its removal. Let him feel what 4 years of invisible labor is worth, she thought, sealing the ledger back into the box. Let him learn the hard way what he only ever thanked the weather for. She drove on before she could second-guess it. The northern pass toward the dead zone was treacherous even in good weather, all switchbacks and loose shale, the kind of road that punished hesitation. In the storm, it was closer to suicide. But Ren had never been afraid of hard roads. She'd built her entire life navigating them. Somewhere around the 3rd hour, the ache in her chest finally caught up to the calm she'd been running on. It arrived all at once, the way grief does when you've been too busy surviving to feel it. A full-body wave of 4 years, 4 years, 4 years that made her hands shake on the wheel for the first time all night. She let herself cry for exactly 2 miles. Then she stopped, because crying wouldn't fix the axle if she hit another sinkhole, and because some part of her, the same part that had rerouted the grain seals with perfect, cold precision, refused to let Roran Vane cost her more than 1 night of tears. "You don't get to break me," she told the storm, told the dark road, told the amber eyes she could still see if she closed hers for too long. You only get to lose me. The vehicle died, just past midnight, the front axle snapping against a rut hidden beneath the sleet. Wren sat in the sudden, ringing silence for a long moment, staring at the fogged windshield, and laughed, a short, humorless sound that surprised her more than the silence had. Of course, she thought. Of course the road agrees this is where it ends. She stepped out into the freezing dark with nothing but a duffel bag, a flashlight, and a pendant of tarnished silver resting cold against her collarbone, exactly as it always had. That was when she felt it. Not fear, not yet. Something quieter, older, a prickling at the base of her skull that had nothing to do with the cold. The forest around her had gone unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that meant something was listening. She reached into her coat without thinking and closed her fingers around the small hunting knife she kept there out of habit, not confidence. 4 years around wolves had taught her that much, at least, that silence in a forest like this one was never actually empty. A low sound rolled out of the dark ahead of her, more felt than heard, vibrating up through the frozen ground and into the soles of her boots. "You're a long way from Duskmere, little bird," a voice said, rough, cold, entirely unbothered by the storm raging around them both. Lost? Or running? Wren didn't lower the flashlight. She aimed it, deliberately, at the center of the voice's chest rather than its eyes. A gesture she'd learned meant respect, not submission in rooms full of men who mistook fear for currency. "Neither," she said, and was faintly surprised to hear her voice come out steady. "I'm exactly where I meant to end up." She had no idea yet how true that sentence would turn out to be. The wolves emerged before the man did, 4 of them, moving out of the sleet like the storm itself had grown teeth. Their fur was matted with ice, their eyes catching Wren's flashlight in flat, predatory flashes. Behind them, unhurried, stepped a man wrapped in a heavy fur-lined coat, his features sharp enough to look carved rather than born. A scar cut down one side of his jaw, pale against skin that seemed to hold no warmth at all. "General," one of the wolves rumbled. Though Wren realized a beat later, it wasn't the wolf who'd spoken. It was him, the voice pitched low, threading directly into her chest the way an alpha's voice always did, whether or not she had wolf blood to answer it. "This isn't Duskmere territory," she said, keeping the light steady. "No," the man agreed. "This is Ironfell's dead zone, which means you're trespassing, little bird, and I haven't decided yet whether that's a problem or an opportunity. I'm not here to cause trouble. My car broke down. Cars don't break down conveniently at the exact border of 2 kingdoms at war." He circled her slowly, unhurried, the wolves fanning out around them both. "Try again." Wren didn't flinch. 4 years of translating Roran's temper into policy had taught her exactly how to hold still in front of a predator without looking like prey. "I left Duskmere tonight. I'm not going back." Something shifted in the man's pale eyes. Not warmth, but interest. Cold and clinical, the way a scientist looks at an anomaly. "The Alpha King's strategist. I've heard of you. Then you know I'm not worthless to whoever takes me in." He tilted his head, studying her the way he might study a locked door he suspected held something valuable behind it. "Walk," he said finally. "If you slow down, the wolves decide what happens to you instead of me." It was somewhere in that walk, stumbling through ice and shale, flanked by silent wolves, her duffel bag slung heavy across one shoulder, that Wren first felt it. The pendant at her throat, cold every day of her life, cold through every winter, and every heartbreak, and every long night bent over ledgers by candlelight, went warm. Not gradually, all at once, a sudden pulse of heat against her collarbone, like something inside the tarnished silver, had woken up and recognized where it was standing. She stopped walking. The lead wolf, the man, she corrected herself, still adjusting to the register of his voice, noticed immediately. "Problem? No," she said, though her hand had already risen, unbidden, to press against the pendant through her coat. It was still warm. Warmer, if anything, The closer they walked toward the black shape of a fortress rising out of the storm ahead. Ironfell's stronghold, carved directly into a glacier, radiating a cold that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with what lived inside it. Warden's Iron, her grandmother's voice echoed, unbidden. From some childhood memory Wren had filed away as superstition years ago. It knows its own kind. It knows what it was made to find. She had never believed that. She'd worn the pendant because it was the last piece of her grandmother she had left, not because she thought it did anything. It was doing something now. Your general, Wren said carefully, testing the shape of the word against the storm. He's not just border patrol. The man beside her, she still didn't have his name, glanced sideways, with something that might have been the beginning of respect. No, he said, he is not. By the time they reached the iron gates of the stronghold, the pendant had gone from warm to hot, an insistent pressure against her sternum that made her breath catch every time the wind shifted and carried the scent of the fortress toward her. Frost and old stone and something underneath it, something ancient and coiled and aware. She didn't understand yet what her body already seemed to know, that whatever slept in her blood, whatever her grandmother had carried and passed down and warned her about in half-joking bedtime stories, had just found something in this fortress it had been waiting 4 generations to answer. She only knew that for the first time since she'd walked out of that study, the cold in her chest wasn't only grief anymore. Something else had started to burn there too. And when the massive doors of the Ironfell stronghold groaned open, revealing a throne room lit by nothing but flickering blue flame, and a king rose from a chair of forged steel to look at her the way no one, not Roran, not anyone, had ever looked at her before, Wren understood, with a certainty that startled her more than the cold ever had, that she had not stumbled into this fortress by accident. She had been called here, long before tonight, long before the storm. She simply hadn't known, until this exact moment, that any part of her had been listening. King Cale Ashgrave did not rise from thrones for trespassers. That was the first thing Wren understood about him, watching the throne room's blue flame catch the sharp planes of his face as he stood. He was nothing like Roran, where Roran was warmth weaponized, charisma that filled a room before he'd said a word. Cale was absence, stillness, a cold so total it became its own kind of gravity, pulling the air in the throne room tight around him. "My king," said the man who'd brought her in. "General," she still didn't know his name. "We found her in the dead zone, Duskmere's strategist. She claims she's not here by accident." Cale's dark eyes moved over her slowly. The mud on her boots, the duffel bag, the defiance she was too exhausted to fully hide. He said nothing for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself became a kind of test. "I know who you are," he said finally. His voice was quiet, unhurried, and somehow more unsettling than if he'd shouted. "Wren Ashcombe, the human who kept Duskmere's ledgers straighter than its king's temper. I didn't realize my reputation crossed borders. Everything of value crosses borders eventually." He descended the dais with an economy of movement that made the general, twice his size, look clumsy by comparison. "The question is what you're worth to me, now that you've walked into my kingdom in the middle of a war. I'm not here to be conquered, if that's what you're hoping." Something flickered across his face. Not quite amusement, something colder and more interested. "I wasn't planning to conquer you. I was going to ask what you know about Duskmere's southern militia agreements that I don't." Before she could answer, the pendant at her throat pulsed, hard, unmistakable, a heartbeat of heat against her collarbone that made her breath catch audibly. Cale's eyes dropped to her chest immediately, sharp and assessing. What was that? Nothing. She pressed her hand flat over the pendant, an instinctive, useless attempt to hide something she didn't understand herself. "Your heart rate just changed. Your scent shifted." He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to keep his gaze. "I've been alive a long time, Miss Ashcombe. I know the difference between fear and something else. That was something else. It's just a keepsake, my grandmother's. Show me. It wasn't a request. Ren hesitated. Old instinct. The same instinct that had kept her guarded through 4 years in another king's house. And then, because some deeper part of her recognized that lying to this particular man would be both useless and dangerous, she drew the pendant out from beneath her collar. Tarnished silver, small, unremarkable, worn smooth by decades of handling. Cale went very still looking at it, the way a man goes still when he recognizes something he'd stopped expecting to find. Where did your grandmother come from? The Eastern Lowlands. Why does that matter? Because that, Cale said slowly, is a warden's mark. And I have spent 30 years being told that bloodline died out 3 generations ago. The word meant nothing to Ren, and everything about the way Cale said it told her it should have. A warden of what? Cale's dark eyes lifted from the pendant to her face, and for the first time since she'd entered the throne room, something like genuine fascination replaced the cold calculation there. Of the bond itself, he said, your bloodline doesn't just serve Alpha Kings, Miss Ashcombe. It can unmake them, sense the fraying edges of a pack's loyalty, sever a mate tether without ever being the mate. Ren's hand closed around the pendant, suddenly understanding why it had never once been cold since she'd crossed into his territory. That's a myth. So was a human running Duskmere's entire Eastern trade network single-handedly, and yet. He tilted his head, something calculating settling back over the fascination, though it didn't fully replace it. I don't deal in myths, little bird. I deal in leverage. And you may be carrying more of it than either of us understood when my general dragged you out of that storm. For the first time since walking out of Roran's study, Ren felt something other than grief steady her spine. Then I'd like a job, she said. Not asylum, not shelter, a seat at your table. Cale studied her for a long moment, measuring, she understood, whether the offer was worth what it would cost him to give a foreign human that kind of power inside his own court. Prove your worth at the War Council tomorrow, he said finally, turning back toward his throne. If what's in your blood is real, Miss Ashcombe, you won't need me to give you a seat. You'll simply take one no one can argue with. Word travels faster across enemy lines than either kingdom likes to admit, and it took less than 2 weeks for Roran Vane to hear the name he'd been dreading. It arrived through Marcus, his beta, who entered the war room with a stack of dispatches clutched hard enough to crease the parchment. The eastern grain routes, Marcus said without preamble, have stabilized. Roran didn't look up from the map spread across his desk. That's good news. It's not our doing. Marcus set the dispatch down harder than necessary. Ironfell brokered new merchant contracts along the northern passes 3 days ago. Reduced tolls, guaranteed escorts. The southern outposts we've been struggling to supply are suddenly receiving grain through routes we don't control, negotiated by someone who understands our accords better than half our own council. Roran's hand stilled over the map. Whose doing is it? Marcus didn't answer immediately, and that alone told Roran everything. Say it. Ren. Marcus's voice was quiet, almost apologetic, as if he'd been the one to put her there, instead of the one who'd simply failed to stop it. She's alive. She's in Ironfell, and apparently, she's already sitting at Cale Ashgrave's war table. The map in front of Roran seemed to blur for a moment, the ink lines rearranging themselves into something he didn't want to read. Cale doesn't take in strays. He kills them or ransoms them. He didn't do either. Marcus exhaled slowly. Word is she walked into his throne room soaked to the bone and offered him strategy instead of mercy. Word is he liked what she offered. Something in Roran's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the failing grain routes, and everything to do with an image he couldn't stop constructing against his will. Ren, in that cold fortress of iron and glacier, sitting across a war table from a man whose reputation for ruthlessness made even seasoned generals uneasy. Get me everything we know about their council, Roran said. Every meeting, every decree, every trade route she's touched. Roran. Marcus's voice carried a warning he rarely used with his king. You need to let this go. She left. You gave her every reason to. I'm not trying to get her back. The lie tasted wrong even as he said it, and by the look on Marcus's face, it landed exactly as unconvincingly as it felt. I need to understand what she's giving him. If she knows our defenses as well as she knew our trade routes, then Ironfell already has everything it needs to bury us, Marcus finished. Yes, that's the part you should actually be afraid of. Roran didn't answer. He was looking, instead, at the far window, at the gardens below where a stone bench sat beneath a weeping willow, the same bench where Wren used to sit with a ledger in her lap, brow furrowed in concentration, entirely unaware of how often he'd watched her from that exact window, and told himself he had time to tell her how much he needed her. He hadn't needed time. He'd needed courage, and he'd spent it all elsewhere, on smaller, easier things. That evening, at supper, Sable tried to fill the silence Wren had left behind, the way she'd been trying for 2 weeks. New seating arrangements, gala preparations, the small domestic performances of a woman auditioning for a role that had already been filled and vacated before she arrived. "You've barely touched your food," Sable observed. "I'm not hungry." "You've been distracted since Marcus's report." She studied him with the particular sharpness of someone who suspected, correctly, that she was losing ground she'd never actually held. "Is it the trade routes, or is it her?" Roran set down his fork. "Does it matter which?" Sable's expression flickered. Not hurt exactly. Something more calculating. The look of a strategist recalculating odds mid-game. "She left because of me. I never expected you to actually mourn it." "You didn't cause this," Roran said, and for the first time in 2 weeks, he said something honest out loud. "I did. You were simply standing there when I finally ran out of ways to hide it." He didn't finish his meal. He excused himself early, walked the corridor past Wren's old study, untouched, exactly as she'd left it, because he still hadn't been able to make himself clear it out, and stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the empty desk, where a woman he'd never properly chosen used to build the foundation his entire kingdom stood on. Somewhere north, past the dead zone, past the mountains that separated 2 warring kingdoms, that same woman was sitting at another king's table, offering her mind to a man who had apparently done, in 2 weeks, what Roran had failed to do in 4 years. He had noticed her, too late, exactly when it no longer belonged to him to notice anything about her at all. The War Council chamber in Ironfell was carved from the same black stone as the rest of the stronghold. A circular room dominated by a massive slate table, its surface etched with a map of the continent that generations of Ironfell strategists had marked, erased, and remarked with the fortunes of 100 border skirmishes. Wren stood at its edge, acutely aware of the dozen hardened faces watching her with open hostility. Kael's generals didn't bow to outsiders, and they clearly weren't inclined to start with a human woman from the kingdom they'd spent a decade choking economically. "My generals believe," Kael said, standing at the head of the table, "that the fastest path to breaking Duskmir's southern rebellion is direct military pressure on their border garrisons. Burn the outposts. Force Roran to overextend. That will cost you 1,000 men," Wren said, before anyone could agree with him, "and it won't work." A grizzled commander bristled. "The human speaks freely." "The human," Wren said evenly, "is the only person in this room who spent 4 years inside those garrisons' supply chains. So yes, I'll keep speaking freely." Kael's mouth curved, faint and private, the expression of a man watching an investment begin to pay dividends. "Explain." Wren stepped up to the slate table and picked up a piece of chalk. "Duskmir's outposts aren't self-sufficient. They never have been. Roran's kingdom survives on grain shipped through the Eastern merchant guilds, who are loyal to profit, not politics." She drew a sharp line across the map. "You don't burn the garrisons. You make the guild's current routes unprofitable. Subsidize the northern passes. Offer military escort. Within 3 weeks, the guilds reroute everything through Ironfell, and Duskmir's outposts starve without a single Ironfell soldier crossing the border." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something inconvenient turns out to be true. The guilds are neutral by treaty, the commander pressed. Attacking their profits could drag the eastern coastal states into this. You're not attacking anything, Ren said. You're making a better offer. There's no treaty against being the more attractive business partner. Kale studied the map, then studied her, something unreadable moving behind his dark eyes. Draft the decree, he said quietly, not breaking her gaze. Effective immediately. But it was what happened next that truly shifted the room's balance. The pendant at Ren's throat, warm now more often than not, pulsed suddenly against her skin as her eyes drifted, unbidden, toward the map's marking of Duskmere's northern watchline. She frowned, pressing 2 fingers briefly to her collarbone. There's a fracture in Duskmere's loyalty structure, along their northern patrol. She said it before she'd fully understood how she knew it. The words simply arrived, clear and certain, the way her grandmother's pendant had begun delivering knowledge she had no logical way of possessing. Kale's eyes sharpened. A fracture, meaning what? Precisely. Meaning at least one pack unit along that line no longer trusts its own chain of command. I can feel it. She said it plainly, without apology, though the words felt strange even as she spoke them. An ability she hadn't asked for, surfacing exactly when it mattered most. The bond between Roran and that unit is fraying. It has been for some time. The commander who doubted her fell silent. General Kale, the man who'd found her in the storm, whose name she'd finally learned over the past 2 weeks, exchanged a look with Kale that Ren couldn't quite read, though she understood, watching it, that she had just crossed some threshold no strategist without wolf blood should have been able to cross. You felt that, Kale said slowly, the way you'd feel a scent or a sound. Yes, that is not a skill, Ren. He said her first name for the first time since she'd arrived, and something in the shift of address landed heavier than she expected. That is a weapon, and I am beginning to understand precisely why the Warden bloodline was hunted to what everyone assumed was extinction. She held his gaze, refusing to let the weight of what she'd just revealed make her flinch. Then you understand why I don't intend to be anyone's weapon. I'll advise this council. I won't be pointed like a blade. Something in Kale's expression shifted. Not offense, but recognition. The particular respect of a man realizing the leverage he'd acquired came with its own terms. Terms he hadn't set and couldn't simply overrule. Understood, he said. And to the visible surprise of every general in the room, he inclined his head to her, not deeply, not performatively, but enough. Enough that everyone at that table understood the balance of power inside it had just permanently changed. Ren set down the chalk, steadying her breathing, aware for the first time in 4 years of exactly how much room she was allowed to take up in a room full of powerful men. Nobody had given her that room. She had simply, finally, taken it. The decree went out within the week, and within 3, exactly as Ren had predicted, Duskmere's grain shipments began to wither. Roran felt it first in the reports. Outposts requesting emergency rations, minor pack alphas withholding tithes because their own supply lines had gone silent. Then he felt it in the war room, where his generals argued in tightening circles, unable to agree on a response that wouldn't cost more than it saved. And then, finally, he felt it in the one place he'd been avoiding since the night Ren left, his own chest, where something had been slowly starving alongside his kingdom. You have to let her go, Marcus said, not for the first time, standing in the doorway of Roran's study while the fire burned low behind him. This isn't strategy anymore, Roran. You're not trying to save Duskmere. You're trying to get her back, and calling it politics. Can't it be both? No, Marcus's voice was uncharacteristically hard. Because if it's both, you'll march into Ironfell to fight for a border, and you'll actually be fighting for a woman who has made it very clear she isn't fighting for you at all. Roran didn't answer. He was staring at the silver ring still sitting exactly where Ren had left it on his study floor weeks ago, untouched, because some part of him had decided, irrationally, that moving it would make the distance between them permanent in a way he wasn't ready for. He rode out 3 days later, alone. against every recommendation his council offered. He found Ren and Kale waiting for him at the edge of the dead zone, exactly as Marcus had once been received. Except this time, Roran came without an army, without terms, without anything resembling the leverage of a king. Ren sat astride a dark horse, dressed in reinforced leather and silver fox fur. Her posture so composed, it barely resembled the woman who'd fled his estate in a storm weeks earlier. Beside her, Kale watched with the stillness of a man who had already anticipated this exact moment, and simply been waiting for it to arrive. "You requested a parley," Kale said, before Roran had even dismounted fully. "I'm not here for the border." Roran's eyes went straight to Ren, ignoring Kale entirely, the way a drowning man ignores everything but the single hand that might pull him up. "I'm here for her." "She isn't a term to be negotiated, Roran." Kale's voice was mild, almost bored, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he'd bristled. "She isn't mine to give back either. Ask her yourself." Roran dismounted, sinking to one knee in the frozen mud without hesitation, without a single thought for how it looked to the soldiers watching from both ridgelines. "Lisa, Ren." He caught himself, and the correction seemed to cost him something. "I was a fool. I let comfort matter more than honesty, and I let you find out the truth instead of hearing it from me, and I have spent every day since regretting it in ways I don't have adequate words for. Come home. I'll give you anything. A seat on the council, half the treasury, whatever it takes." Ren looked down at him for a long moment, and Roran watched her face for the flicker of warmth he used to find there so easily, the softness she used to save only for him, in quiet moments by the study fire, before politics and silence had eroded all of it away. He found nothing but a calm, unhurried clarity that unsettled him more than anger would have. "You're offering me things, Roran," she said finally. "A seat, a treasury, a title. You're still doing exactly what you always did, trying to buy back what you never once simply gave me for free. That's not. It is." Her voice wasn't cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was patient, the tone of someone explaining something to a man who was only now, far too late, capable of hearing it. "I didn't leave because you didn't offer me enough, Roran. I left because you never once told me the truth before I had to discover it myself. And you're still not offering me truth. You're offering me leverage, hoping it looks enough like love that I won't notice the difference." Roran's jaw tightened, kneeling in the snow, the cold finally beginning to register against skin that had gone numb from something other than weather. "Then tell me what would be enough." Ren was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, Kale watched her with an expression Roran couldn't read and didn't have the right to try. "Nothing you have left to offer," she said finally, "because the thing I needed from you was never a possession you could hand over on command. It had to be a choice you made before I ever had to ask for it. You didn't make that choice, Roran. Not once, in 4 years." She turned her horse, unhurried, deliberate. "Pay the tariffs, or lose the South. Either way, I'm not the woman who's going to fix it for you anymore." And as she rode back toward the black glacier fortress that had, somehow, in a matter of weeks, become the first place she'd ever been chosen, rather than simply used, Roran remained kneeling in the frozen mud of a border he no longer had the power to hold, realizing, far too late, that some kingdoms fall not from war, but from every small truth a king was too comfortable to tell. Roran didn't return to the dead zone. There was nothing left to negotiate, and some part of him, the part that had finally, agonizingly, learned to listen, understood that riding out a second time would only prove he'd learned nothing at all. Ren rode back through Ironfell's gates with her spine straight and her chest strangely light, as though something she'd been carrying for years had finally been set down in the snow behind her, instead of hauled forward into whatever came next. Kale said nothing until they'd passed through the iron doors of the stronghold, the cold, familiar dark closing around them both. "You could have taken the treasury," he said finally, walking beside her through the torchlit corridor. "Half of it would have rebuilt 3 winters of Ironfell's supply losses on its own. I know. You didn't want it. I wanted to stop being someone men handed things to, instead of someone they told the truth. She stopped walking, turning to face him fully in the flickering blue light. You've never once tried to buy my loyalty, Kale. You asked for my mind, and you paid me in respect, instead of promises. That's worth more to me than a treasury ever could be. Something shifted behind his dark eyes. Not triumph, not the satisfaction of a man watching a rival lose. Something quieter. I didn't bring you here to replace what he failed to give you. I know that too. She held his gaze, steady, unflinching, the same way she'd held it the first night he found her freezing in his dead zone. That's exactly why I'm staying. The following weeks unfolded with the particular clarity of a life finally built on her own terms, rather than someone else's need for her. Wren's seat at Ironfell's War Council became permanent, not granted as a favor, but earned, week after week, decree after decree, until even the generals who'd once bristled at her presence began seeking her counsel before Kale's. The Warden bloodline, once considered myth, became something Ironfell's scholars studied with quiet fascination, and something Wren herself learned to wield carefully, not as a weapon pointed at anyone's command, but as a discipline she alone chose how and when to use. She sensed fractures. She never forced them open unless the cause was worth the cost. And unlike her years in Duskmere, no one ever again decided that choice for her. Duskmere, meanwhile, survived, bruised, humbled, forced finally to pay Ironfell's tariffs and rebuild its economy on foundations that didn't depend on one woman's invisible labor. Roran ruled on, alone in the ways that mattered most, having finally learned, far too late to matter to the person who might once have needed to hear it, that a kingdom built on someone else's silence eventually collapses under the weight of everything it never said out loud. He sent one letter, months later. Not a plea, not an offer, just 3 lines, delivered by a courier who didn't wait for a reply. You were right. I never chose you. I only ever failed to lose you sooner than I did. I hope wherever you've landed, someone finally chooses you the way you deserve to be chosen from the beginning. Wren read it once, standing at the window of the chambers that were now fully, unmistakably hers. Not a guest's quarters, not a strategist's borrowed room, but a queen's private study, lined with ledgers she maintained because she wanted to, not because no one else could. She didn't cry reading it. She simply folded the letter once, set it in a drawer she rarely opened, and returned to the war table where Kale was waiting, mid-argument with a border commander about spring trade projections. No, she said, taking her seat beside him, not behind him, not below him, beside him, exactly where she'd insisted her place would be from the very first week. Just closing an old ledger, Kale studied her for a moment. Something almost gentle passed behind the ice of his usual composure. Does it need answering? No. Wren picked up her chalk, turning her attention back to the map spread across the slate table, back to the kingdom she had helped build from the ground up, on terms she had set herself. Some debts don't need to be repaid. They just need to be recognized for what they cost, and then left behind. Outside, the glacier caught the last light of a long winter sun, throwing pale gold across ice that had once felt, to Wren, like the coldest place she could imagine landing. It didn't feel cold anymore. It felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like a place she had chosen for herself, rather than a place she had simply been necessary to. She was no longer the woman who ran someone else's kingdom in exchange for being needed. She was the queen who had learned, at last, that being chosen and being used were never the same thing, and that the difference between them was worth crossing an entire storm, an entire war, and an entire kingdom to finally understand. The story of Duskmere's fall was, in the end, never really about a border. It was about a woman who stopped waiting to be seen and started building a life in the one place that finally saw her clearly.